Let's start the discussion on reproductive system. At the outset, let me say this. This system is different from all the other systems of the body in the sense that all the other systems, their primary aim seems to be contribution in homeostasis. Reproductive system, its primary aim is not homeostasis. It does not contribute directly in homeostasis. Then what is its primary aim? Survival of the species. That's the primary aim of the reproductive system. It is designed in such a way that cell from one individual is able to survive in the body of another individual to give rise to a new individual, and thereby survival and growth of the species. So it's only an indirect way of homeostasis, not direct one. But that's primary aim of the reproductive system. Now, before we actually discuss the female and male reproductive systems individually, let me just talk about the puberty, from which point there is maturation of reproductive organs, and therefore that how it occurs needs to be understood. After birth, for most of the period, the gonads in both sexes are quiescent. If you look at, for instance, male fetuses, during fetal life there is one burst of testosterone, and after birth there is one more burst of the testosterone. But after that, the gonads are quiescent. In both sexes, in fact, they are quiescent until puberty. Now, what happens is, at puberty, they will be activated by gonadotropins, and then there will be the final maturation of the reproductive system. Now, what happens that brings about the onset of puberty? Well, until puberty, the GnRH secretions by the hypothalamus are there, but they are not cyclic or pulsatile manner. So one observation is that it is the pulsatile GnRH secretion which brings about the onset of puberty. GnRH secreting neurons or hypothalamic neurons are said to be under inhibitory control of GABAergic neurons, melatonin, endorphin, and also the circulating sex steroids, whatever little amount that there is, it keeps the hypothalamic GnRH secretion suppressed, and therefore that is the period when the GnRH secretion is not pulsatile. As it starts becoming pulsatile, that brings about the onset of puberty. In girls, how the sequence of events happen? The first event is thelarchy, enlargement of the breasts, followed by pubarchy, development of axillary and pubic hair, and then menarche, onset of menses. Another event that is seen at the time of puberty is adrenarche, where there is a secretion of adrenal androgens. So that's the onset of puberty and the sequence of events that happens. Now, with this small little introduction, let's now talk about first the female reproductive system. So far as the female reproductive system is concerned, the female reproductive functioning is inherently cyclic in nature, and the reproductive organ, the ovaries, basically they are designed to perform two functions. As the hormone secreting organ, there are two functions that are performed by ovaries. One is locally ovarian sex steroids. They are secreted locally and they will nurture the germ cell or the ovum, development of the ovum, and followed by extrusion of the ovum, ovulation it's called. And second is ovarian sex steroids will also be circulating. Ovarian hormones will circulate and they will act on the distant target tissues, target organs, a variety of organs, starting with hypothalamus, pituitary, breasts, adipose tissue, bones, liver, and even the near organs, uterus, fallopian tubes, and so on. So that's basically the function of the ovarian sex steroids. The fundamental reproductive unit in the female is a single ovarian follicle. It's composed of one germ cell followed by the cluster of endocrine cells. So that's basically the fundamental reproductive unit. So let's see the biology of the oogenesis and folliculogenesis. Basically, a germ cell surrounded by those cluster of endocrine cells makes the follicle, and that's the basic reproductive unit, fundamental unit. Let's see how the ovum develops and how the follicle develops. So oogenesis and folliculogenesis. Let's first see the oogenesis. You know, the primary germ cells are termed as oogonia. When during the embryonic life, up to fifth month of the embryonic life or so, there would be the mitotic division with increasing number of oogonia. But after that, this division will stop and the meiotic division is going to start. So after fifth month of the intrauterine life, the number of ova are not going to increase. Now, in fact, no new ova are formed after birth. Maximum 7 million is the number of ova by fifth or sixth month of the intrauterine life. Many of them are going to undergo atresia, so that at the time of birth there are only about 2 million ova left. At the time of birth, out of these also 50% are atretic. They are going to undergo atresia and involution. They are going to be lost, and 50% now the first meiotic division is going to start at this point of time. So they will enter the first meiotic division, but this first meiotic division will be arrested in the prophase stage. This will be arrested in the prophase stage, and then out of those which survive, they will persist till the adulthood. But one thing should be understood, that there is a continuing atresia during the development, so that at the time of puberty there would be about 3 lakh ova or so left, and during the entire reproductive lifespan of a female there would be about 1 ovum release every month. So anywhere between 400 to 700 ova are actually required. Now this oocyte attrition occurs by the process of apoptosis. The atresia and the attrition of the oocyte. So apoptosis is stimulated by certain factors. For example, TGF beta, transforming growth factor beta, FAS ligand. These are the factors and their receptors. They stimulate apoptosis of the oogonia or the oocytes, and there are various survival factors also. They will oppose the apoptosis. For example, FGF, fibroblast growth factor, is the one that is a survival factor, or LIF, leukocyte inhibitory factor, KIT ligand. These are the survival factors. They will oppose the apoptosis. Whereas these are the factors which stimulate the apoptosis, and therefore they will cause atresia. Now, only one ovum is going to be released. Now, this oocyte which has entered the first meiotic division, and it has been arrested in the prophase stage. When the puberty is attained, after that only one ovum is going to be released every month. What happens is, just before the ovulation, first meiotic division will be completed. First polar body will be cast off and the secondary oocyte will be formed. Now this secondary oocyte will immediately enter the second meiotic division. So this needs to be clearly understood that just before the ovulation, first meiotic division which was arrested will be completed now, and the oocyte, secondary oocyte will be formed. It will immediately enter the second meiotic division. But then second meiotic division will be also arrested in the metaphase stage. And this second meiotic division will be completed immediately after the fertilization of the ovum. If the ovum is fertilized, then the second meiotic division will be completed. So that's about the oogenesis. Let's see the biology of folliculogenesis. Now basically, under the ovarian capsule, there are lots of primordial follicles. So a germ cell surrounded by the endocrine cells. Now the primary oocyte is surrounded by the granulosa cells. And this the germ cell surrounded by the granulosa cells, it's called as the primary follicle or the primordial follicle. Now as the granulosa cells proliferate, they form a multi-layered epithelium around the oocyte, and at this stage it will be called as a secondary follicle. And then secondary follicle will acquire about 3 to 6 granulosa cells, and finally what happens is those granulosa cells, they will secrete certain paracrine factors so that the surrounding stromal cells will be differentiated into epithelioid cells called as theca cells. So the primary oocyte followed by the granulosa cells, and they will secrete certain paracrine factor to form these epithelioid cells called as theca cells. This will now form the matured pre-antral follicle, the matured follicle or the pre-antral follicle. That's how the ovum and the follicles are formed. Now let's see what happens during those cyclic changes which we talked about, the inherently cyclic nature of the female reproductive system, starting with the menstrual cycle. Now, at the start of each cycle, once the puberty is attained and menarche has been attained, menstrual cycles are going to begin. At the start of every month, at the start of each cycle, several of the follicles are going to enlarge. What happens is, a cavity is formed around the ovum. This cavity or the antrum will be formed. This is called as antrum formation. A cavity will be formed around this ovum. This is filled with a follicular fluid. The antral fluid or the follicular fluid, it contains lots of substances, mucopolysaccharides, GAGs, electrolytes, FSH, LH, several growth factors, IGF-1, IGF-2, TGF-beta, and so on and so forth. So what happens is 5 to 6 follicles will begin to grow at the start of each cycle. But by 5th or 6th day, one follicle will become dominant. One follicle becomes dominant and the other ones become atretic. Now, this dominant follicle will grow further. Other follicles will undergo atresia. What decides whether that follicle is going to grow further and become the dominant follicle? It depends on ability of that follicle to secrete high levels of estrogen. In fact, high mitotic index of the granulosa cells surrounding that ovum is the key feature, characteristic feature of this selected dominant follicle, selected follicle from the cohort of follicles. The high mitotic index is a very characteristic feature in the granulosa cells, and the ability to secrete the high levels of estrogens. Now basically estrogen from the ovaries, it comes from two places or two cells. All the circulating estrogen, it comes from the theca interna cells, whereas the local estrogen which is there in that follicle or in the follicular fluid, that local estrogen comes from the granulosa cells. Now what happens at the 14th day? Basically this one dominant follicle is growing. At 14th day there is going to be rupture of the follicle and the ovum will be extruded. So ovum extruded out of the follicle, ovums with surrounding cells, so-called cumulus oophorus. Now this ovum, this process is called as ovulation, and this ovum will be taken by the fimbriated end of the fallopian tube and then will be transported. If the fertilization occurs, then the fertilized ovum will be implanted in the endometrium, or otherwise it will be discarded. So that's the process of ovulation. Remaining part of the follicle will now convert into corpus luteum. Basically on the very first day there is going to be bleeding into the follicle, so it will now convert into corpus hemorrhagicum first. Once the ovum has been released, the remaining part of the follicle will have first the bleeding. Minor bleeding into the peritoneal cavity and associated lower abdominal pain is sometimes called as Mittelschmerz. Now granulosa cells and theca cells will promptly line that follicle, the corpus luteum, and now those cells will be called as theca lutein cells and granulosa lutein cells. From now on, corpus luteum will take on that endocrine function of the ovaries. Now growth of the corpus luteum depends on the blood supply, and here it has been observed that the factor called as VEGF is necessary for the growth of corpus luteum, because it will have abundant blood supply to the corpus luteum. First, the corpus hemorrhagicum, the blood bleeding into the corpus luteum, follicle and corpus hemorrhagicum on the first day after the ovulation. It will then convert into lipid-rich cells, the lutein cells or the lipid-rich yellow-colored cells, when it converts into the corpus luteum. Now, this corpus luteum will survive, as I was describing, survives and thrives because of this factor called as vascular endothelial growth factor, VEGF, because there is abundant blood supply to this corpus luteum. And the important fact is the main secretion of this corpus luteum is now going to be progesterone. The early part of the cycle was dominated by the estrogen levels into the follicle and the circulating estrogen levels. But once the ovulation has occurred and the follicle has been converted into corpus luteum, it will be dominated by the levels of progesterone. Now, if the pregnancy occurs, then the corpus luteum will persist, and it's called as corpus luteum of pregnancy. But if the pregnancy has not occurred, fertilization and pregnancy has not occurred, then there would be luteolysis. The corpus luteum will regress and disappear, the process called as luteolysis. Just about 4 days prior to the onset of next cycle, this luteolysis, or 24th day of the cycle, there would be start of luteolysis, and finally the corpus luteum will be replaced with the scar tissue and will look white, will be converted into corpus albicans. So that's about the follicular development and folliculogenesis. We were talking about the menstrual cycle and what happens to that follicle. Now let's see the endometrial cycle. This was the ovarian cycle and what happens to the follicle inside the ovary. Let us now see the uterine cycle during the same phase. Basically, the cycle was divided so far as the follicle was concerned. First part was called as follicular phase, and the later part, once the ovum was released after the ovulation, it was called as luteal phase. Now let's see what is happening concurrently in the uterus, uterine cycle or menstrual cycle, endometrial cycle. Basically, when corpus luteum is regressing at the end of the previous cycle, what happens is there will be sudden fall in the levels of estrogen and progesterone, and hormonal support to the endometrium will be withdrawn. So endometrium will begin to be shed, and that will be the onset of menses. So first 4 days, roughly about 1 to 4 days of that endometrial cycle or uterine cycle will be called as the menstrual phase, when estrogen, progesterone levels and FSH, LH levels dropped, hormonal support to the endometrium is withdrawn, and the bleeding starts. The tissue is going to be shed now, there will be bleeding. So that phase is called as menstrual cycle. Then 5th to 14th day is called as proliferative phase. Now there is going to be proliferation of the cells. Basically, thickness of the endometrium is going to grow from 5th to 14th day. Glands are going to increase in size. So all this collectively is called as the pre-ovulatory phase or the proliferative phase. Now what happens is, telomeres at the end of each chromosome, which are shortened during each mitosis, and finally it leads to apoptosis. These are repaired by the enzyme called as telomerase. So high estradiol levels during this phase it stimulates the or induces high levels of telomerase, and therefore there will be repairing of those ends of the telomers, so that apoptosis will be prevented in the endometrium. We need the endometrium to grow. We don't want the apoptosis to occur. So high estrogen levels during this phase, they induce high levels of telomerase activity. There will be repair of those telomers at the ends of the each chromosome, and therefore apoptosis will be prevented. That's how the proliferative phase occurs up to the roughly about 14th day. And then, since ovulation has occurred, there would be 15th to 20th day, which will be called as secretory phase. So, post-ovulatory phase or secretory phase. Now, endometrium is going to be highly vascularized and slightly edematous. There is going to be secretions by the glands, copious secretions by the glands under the influence of corpus luteum, which has been formed into the ovary. In contrast to estradiol, which suppresses the apoptosis by inducing the telomerase, progesterone suppresses the telomerase so that the telomers are lost and apoptosis of the endometrial cells is facilitated. That's the difference between the action of estrogen and progesterone. So at this stage, the secretory phase, which is marked by high levels of progesterone, glands become coiled and tortuous. Then they begin to secrete a clear fluid. So that's a secretory phase or a luteal phase. They coincide. Now basically endometrium, if you see the endometrium, its inner two-thirds of the endometrial wall, superficial two-third or inner this two-third part is called as stratum functionale, and it's supplied by long coiled spiral arteries, whereas the deep one-third is called as stratum basale and is supplied by the basilar arteries. This is stratum functionale, and it is this part which is going to be shed. It's going to be it's supplied by the spiral arteries, and this part is going to be shed, whereas this part of the endometrium this outer part will be stratum basale, which will not be shed. It's supplied by the basilar arteries. So if the ovum was not fertilized, corpus luteum is going to regress, and the hormonal support to the endometrium will be withdrawn, and thereby end of secretory phase, and then next cycle will start with the onset of menstruation. How does that happen? Is that there would be patches of necrosis will occur in the endometrium first, and then they will coalesce to form large patches. First the spotty hemorrhages, which will coalesce, and then eventually the bleeding will start. The vasospasm will occur. The vessels, the arteries going into the endometrium, there would be vasospasm, and one factor which is responsible for this vasospasm and therefore the ischemia and necrosis, foci of necrosis, that factor is prostaglandins, basically the locally released prostaglandins, particularly PGF2 alpha is said to be particularly relevant in this vasospasm. So from the point of view of endometrial function, we can say like this: from 5th to 14th day, there is restoration of endometrium which was shed during the menstruation. So that will be restored during the proliferative phase, and then secretory phase is preparation of the endometrium for a possible fertilized ovum to get implanted into the endometrium. So that's how the menstrual cycle occurs. The ovarian cycle, where follicular phase and luteal phase, and uterine cycle in the endometrial cycle, with these three phases. But one thing that must be mentioned is that the cycle length varies, and this length varies because of the first phase of the cycle, follicular phase of the cycle. Luteal phase or the secretory phase is remarkably constant. It's 14 days. So it should be said that ovulation occurs 14 days prior to the onset of the next menstrual cycle. This length is remarkably fixed at 14 days. It is this length, the first phase of the cycle, which may or may not be fixed, and it varies from individual to individual, and accordingly, I mean, if it is 14 days, then the total cycle length would be 28 days. But if the cycle length is let's say 34 days, that means this is 20 days and this would be exactly 14 days. So that's the cycle length and the changes that occur. So if you look at the menstrual blood, it's predominantly arterial in origin. Only about 25% or so comes from the venous blood, venous origin. Menstrual blood is predominantly arterial in origin. It contains tissue debris, prostaglandins. It also contains fibrinolysin, and that's the reason why menstrual blood does not clot. Average amount of the blood loss is about 30 ml. If you look at the cyclic changes that occur in other tissues, cyclic changes in the cervix during the menstrual cycle. First half of the cycle is predominated by the estrogen, and estrogen makes the cervical mucus thinner and more alkaline, so that these are the changes that promote survival and transport of the sperm. After the ovulation, the phase is predominated by the progesterone. Progesterone will make the cervical mucus thick, tenacious and cellular. The mucus is thinnest at the type of ovulation, and its elasticity, which is called as spin Barkett, so much so that it can be stretched into a long thin thread, and if you put it on a slide and let it dry, it dries out in an arborizing pattern, which is called as fern-like pattern. So these are the changes in the cervical mucus. After the ovulation and during pregnancy, it becomes thick. Cervical mucus will become thick, and it will again fail to transport the sperm, obviously, and it will therefore fails to form the fern pattern. Vaginal cycle, under the influence of estrogen in first part of the cycle, the vaginal epithelium becomes cornified, whereas the second half of the cycle means in the influence of progesterone, a thick mucus is secreted and the epithelium proliferates under the influence of progesterone. It will become infiltrated with leukocytes. Then cyclic changes in the breasts. Estrogen will cause proliferation of the mammary ducts, whereas progesterone will cause proliferation or growth of the lobules and alveoli. So these are the changes in the menstrual cycle. Let's also talk about the ovarian steroidogenesis. let's see some of the aspects of ovarian steroidogenesis. Let's look at the ovarian steroidogenesis. Before ovulation, the LH and FSH, they act on the cells of the developing follicle. Now, the theca cells, they have the receptors for LH. So LH acts on the theca receptors, thecal receptors on the theca cells, and the granulosa cells have receptors for both FSH and LH. So the theca cells and the theca lutein cells in the corpus luteum, they can take up cholesterol and produce testosterone from it, but and that occurs under the influence of LH basically. But then those theca cells, they do not have the aromatase enzyme, which is necessary for the conversion of testosterone into estrogen. So that aromatase enzyme is present in the granulosa cells. So it's like this. The LH acting on the theca cells will take up the cholesterol, and theca and theca lutein cells, they will take up the cholesterol, form the androgen or testosterone, and then granulosa cells have aromatase enzyme, so that testosterone will converted into estrogen. That conversion is under the influence of FSH. So FSH upregulates the aromatase enzyme, so that finally the estrogen will be formed. After the ovulation, there is luteinization of the follicle. So theca lutein cells and granulosa lutein cells, now they proliferate, they differentiate, and that occurs under the influence of LH. So LH, luteinizing hormone, is said to have this luteotrophic action. Maintenance of corpus luteum is under the influence of LH, and the predominant hormone that is secreted by the corpus luteum is progesterone. So basically corpus luteum will produce both estrogen and progesterone, but predominant hormone in the luteal phase will be progesterone. Estrogen production by the follicle is largely the function of theca lutein cells, and progesterone production by the corpus luteum is primarily the function of granulosa lutein cells. Now let us see the hormonal patterns during the menstrual cycle, particularly the pituitary gonadotropins and the ovarian steroids. Toward the end of the luteal phase, the levels of FSH and LH, they decrease markedly. They are at their lowest level. If you see the LH to FSH ratio, this ratio will be just about greater than 1 toward the end of the luteal phase. 1 or 2 days before the onset of menses, the FSH levels will begin to rise. Now, there will be follicular phase. In the second half of the follicular phase, let's say about 8 to 14 days or so, the FSH levels will slightly decrease. They have begun to increase just before the onset of menses, and now they will fall slightly or modestly, and the LH levels will begin to rise. So this ratio was just about 1 at the end of the previous cycle, toward the end of the previous cycle, end of the luteal phase. Then the next cycle has started. FSH levels had begun to rise at the start of the cycle. They slightly decrease, or rather modestly decrease, and LH levels begin to rise in the second part of the follicular phase. So the LH to FSH ratio in this second part of the cycle, it will increase, and it will increase to about 2. In the follicular stage or late follicular stage. And then what happens is, just before the ovulation, there would be a mid-cycle LH surge. LH levels will increase dramatically, and LH to FSH ratio will be about 5 during that period, just about the ovulation. So that's how the FSH and LH, the gonadotropins, pituitary gonadotropins, their levels are. Then the LH levels will be higher, FSH levels have dropped, and then just before the onset of next menstrual cycle, the gonadotropin levels will decrease and the ratio will come back to 1 again. Now, that's and we already mentioned that first part of the cycle, predominantly FSH, it's called as the follicular phase, and estrogen, the main ovarian steroid. Later, second half of the cycle, LH, luteotrophic action on the corpus luteum, and secretion of progesterone. So that's these are the hormonal patterns. Just one more addition. LH surge, mid-cycle LH surge. How does that happen? Estrogen creates a positive feedback with the LH. So estrogen had kept LH suppressed for the first part of the cycle. But then just before the ovulation, there would be mid-cycle LH surge, which leads to ovulation. How does that happen? Is that estrogen creates a positive feedback on the LH. Now, for that to happen, a critical plasma estradiol level of about 200 picogram per ml is necessary, and that level should be sustained for about 2 days. Only then there would be this positive feedback of estrogen on the LH, resulting in the LH surge. So that's one critical component of the LH surge. The estrogen levels have to be slightly higher than 200 picogram per ml, and they should be sustained for about 2 days. Now, what happens with the LH surge? Why it leads to ovulation? There are certain components that play on the follicle and rupture of follicle and then ovulation. For example, there would be stimulation of progesterone levels. Progesterone levels are going to increase, and they will increase the proteolytic enzyme activity there locally. There would be distensibility of the follicle to increase. Follicular fluid content will increase. Fluid will be increased in the follicle so that the wall will become tense. Ovum is going to be released by the rupture of the follicular wall. Second is, LH surge also induces the enzyme prostaglandin endoperoxidase synthase. Prostaglandin endoperoxidase synthase. This enzyme is in the granulosa cells, and LH induces this enzyme. So now what happens is, it increases the synthesis of prostaglandins, thromboxanes, leukotrienes, and this results in a pseudo-inflammatory response. This pseudo-inflammatory response in turn will cause follicular rupture, and then the ovum will be released. Apart from that, there will be stimulation of plasminogen activator. It will be stimulated by the FSH. It generates the plasmin, and that catalyzes the breakdown of the follicular wall. So plasmin formed from plasminogen under the influence of FSH is also known to help by causing breakdown of the follicular wall. So these are some of the components triggered by the LH surge, basically with some help from the FSH, of course, that results in ovulation. So now luteal phase, post-ovulatory phase, LH, we have said it is essential for maintenance of the corpus luteum. One more factor to be added is that if fertilization has occurred, then the placental hormone HCG will come into effect, and further maintenance of the corpus luteum will be achieved. But if that does not happen, the LH equivalent, that is HCG, does not come into effect, then the corpus luteum regresses. Luteolysis occurs by apoptosis of the luteal cells, and one factor is known to be oxytocin. LH, or rather estrogen from a non-pregnant female, it is known to cause some release of oxytocin from the posterior pituitary, as well as there will be release of oxytocin locally in the corpus luteum, and that is known to cause luteolysis. So oxytocin is known to play an important role. It stimulates the production of a prostaglandin, which is PGF2 alpha, and which in turns it inhibits the action of LH on the corpus luteum, so, or the luteal cells. So that will result in luteolysis. That's the summary of female reproductive system and its hormones and their actions and the menstrual cycle.